This 11th of July, 1791, is a memorable scene because Voltaire's body is brought to the Pantheon, and so before arriving at the Pantheon, it crosses all of Paris according to scheduled stages.
The first step is the Bastille, and then after, since Voltaire is a man of letters and a man of theatre, the procession goes by the main Parisian theatres. Troops are there, reciting texts, singing his praises.
The procession will also stop at the most moving moment of its journey in front of the place where Voltaire died. That is to say, the Hôtel de Villette, located on the Quai de Théatin, and which will later becomes Quai Voltaire.
The ashes are in a coffin. There is a porphyry sarcophagus. It's really all the antique theme, with a chariot drew by white horses.
Ahead, an entire garrison of gunners and drummers precedes the convoy. Children are there as well.
It was such a huge procession that a chronicler even said it was a true national holiday. It is truly the celebration of the nation reunited around the body of Voltaire.
When they arrive at the Pantheon, it is night. And something important to note is that the bishop who was supposed to consecrate Voltaire's arrival at the Pantheon is absent.
Because, as a clergyman, the bishop did not want to receive the remains of a man who had fought the church throughout his life.
It is through the doors behind me that, after crossing Paris, Voltaire's remains enter the Pantheon. That's the moment he becomes a great man. He enters this monument, initially built to be a church and transformed into a pantheon for him. Voltaire's tomb is made from the catafalque that had crossed Paris. It is important especially for all the inscriptions that showcase the significance of the great man, historian, philosopher, poet. But it is also the recognition by the National Assembly of Voltaire's immortal genius. So he has a very special place, physically, since he is in the front part of the crypt. The other great women and great men are in more traditional vaults, and they have to pass before Voltaire's tomb to enter the Pantheon. Voltaire was joined in 1794 by Rousseau, a nod to their fated friendship in a way. They now face each other in the monument. Although they had quarreled a bit at the end of their lives, according to the National Assembly of the time, they were the two philosophers who enlightened the Enlightenment and championed liberty. During the Bourbon Restoration, the monument is transformed again into a church. At that point, there is talk of removing Voltaire from what has become the Church of Sainte-Geneviève, and Louis XVIII says this about Voltaire: "Leave him here. He will be punished by hearing Mass every day." So Voltaire remains in the monument.
Voltaire is today the oldest figure to remain in the Pantheon. At the time of his enthronement in July 1791, France was experiencing an unprecedented historical situation. The storming of the Bastille took place 2 years earlier, but the Republic has not yet been proclaimed.
The revolution seeks new heroes who are not saints, who are not kings, who are not men of war. And so they started looking for men from the unseasoned regime, already dead, but who had somehow announced the revolution.
To see Voltaire as the architect of the revolution is both true and false. It's true because it's clear that the ideas Voltaire defended were the foundation upon which the revolution was built. But it's false historically, because Voltaire was a man of the ancien regime who probably never thought that the monarchy could be overthrown.
Voltaire was attached to the monarchy. But only if the monarchy was constitutional and tolerant, but he was absolutely not a Republican.
It is also one of the most talented philosophers of the 18th century that the National Assembly is thus crowning. A bubbling mind that contrasts with his appearance.
As much as Voltaire appears frail, weak and puny physically, is he not just as intelligent, lively and sharp-eyed intellectually?
The gaze, for Voltaire, is essential. He had a gaze that captured everything, a gaze that rendered everything it has seen. And he obviously had extremely vast intellectual capabilities. He is the man of the Enlightenment in every sense of the term.
He was an adventurer. He had a very turbulent, very clandestine life of an adventurer, constantly fighting as if in perpetual war.
He was someone who had undoubtedly quite a presence, and who maintained a kind of tradition with his large wig like Louis XIV, which was completely out of style. Voltaire is a singular character.
As for his personality, Voltaire has always known his own worth. He always knew he was among the greatest, someone who could contribute much to his contemporaries.
François-Marie Arouet was born in 1694, that is, at the end of the reign of Louis XIV. He was born almost dying. It was thought he would not live. He was a poor little frail being, and ultimately he resisted very well.
His father belongs to the bourgeoisie and was a notary. He is a collector at the Cour des Comptes. So it is a relatively well-off bourgeoisie, but they're not rolling in money either.
François-Marie's mother dies when he is only 6 years old. Raised by his father alongside an older brother and sister, the young boy receives an exceptional education. At 10 years old, he enters the Lycée Louis le Grand, the most prestigious institution in the kingdom, run by the Jesuits.
Louis le Grand is a place where both the sons of the bourgeoisie and the sons of the highest nobility are educated. And the young Arouet has an extremely keen instinct for making connections.
I am thinking, for example, of the d'Argenson brothers, who will come to power. One will be the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the other the Minister of War. So he meets all these people who will have a prestigious future. And of course, these alliances will allow him to have networks in the highest circles.
If François-Marie is not treated as well as some of his classmates, he will quickly stand out for his intelligence.
The young aristocrats, some of them, have a private room with their servants, with their own prefect, and the young Arouet is condemned to share the dormitory with 15 or even 20 of his fellow students. The subjects taught at Louis le Grand include dissertation in Latin, writing poems in Latin as well, versification. Voltaire is particularly gifted in these exercises of amplification, in these exercises that involve a sense of rhetoric. And this is how he is already getting noticed.
There is a record of young Arouet's talent as an orator, a work kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in the rare books section.
So here we have in front of us an incredibly touching object, which is a New Year's gift book that was given to the young François-Marie Arouet in January 1710. He is 16 years old. He just won the first prize in Latin eloquence. He was the best Latinist in his college, and as a reward, he was given this very large history book with the monogram of the Society of Jesus on the cover. On the first page, we find a diploma since he had the best results and he signed it, so it's his very first autograph, Franciscum Arouet, François Arouet in Latin. This is a volume he will not keep throughout his life, since we find on page 655 an unpublished verse by Voltaire, "Of my past glory, illustrious testimonial, for 52 sous I put you in pledge." That means at one point he needed money, and he pawned it for 52 sous. He never recovered it. It then passed through the hands of collectors until it arrived here at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. It is a document that is extremely touching, since it is very likely the first known autograph of Voltaire. No older one is known. It is the first time that he signs something. It is also the first time that he has a bit of pride as an author or thinker, since he has just won a public speaking contest. So it's the birth of his career as a thinker that we're witnessing. It's truly a relic.
At Louis-le-Grand, François-Marie must conform to the liturgical ceremonies that punctuate the day. However, he also benefits from the Jesuits' education, characterized by a broad openness to the world.
It is about forming what we would today call a true citizen, that is, someone who is deeply Christian, of course, but who is open to the realities of their time. Hence the importance of travel, of history, hence the importance of this constant openness, and of course, of theatre. Theatre is an opening onto the city.
Young Arouet develops a taste for theatre. He acts not in comedies, but in tragedies. And there, Voltaire already blossoms and certainly thinks about writing.
The personality of the future Voltaire is also shaped by the influence of his godfather, the Abbé de Châteauneuf, a witty man, member of the Société du Temple. A world apart that François-Marie would have discovered at the age of 13.
The Abbé de Châteauneuf introduces him to the Société du Temple, which is a sort of microcosm right in the heart of Paris. And it represents everything Voltaire will love: the aristocratic, worldly, libertine side, the witty remark.
People converse there, they write poems, they celebrate a little. In short, it's an Epicurean society, a society that lives for pleasure and also for free thought.
It's an open environment, very different from that of the Jesuits, where people with much more radical views, especially against religion, much less conformist, circulate. And so it's an important environment for the young Arouet, because it opens up new horizons for him.
But the new horizons for the young boy do not stop there. His godfather introduces him to one of his old friends, Ninon de l'Enclos, a famous courtesan who is already very old.
He is not very charmed by Ninon. He will say that she was like an old mummy, completely dried up. And Ninon, nevertheless, who was also a woman of great culture, realizes that the adolescent she sees is of exceptional intelligence, and she leaves him a small legacy in her will.
With this money, François-Marie will go buy books, because his choice is made. There is no question of following the career set out by his father. His bourgeois background is now too narrow for his ambition.
When the young Arouet leaves Louis-le-Grand, he is not yet called Voltaire, but he is already in the mindset of the future Voltaire. He already wants to be a man of letters. He already wants to be a man of the pen.
Obviously, for his father, it's truly scandalous because poets are starving artists. Being a poet is not a profession.
His father sees him studying law. His father possibly sees him as a notary while he wants to enter the domain of belles lettres. So there is an initial form of rejection from his father.
And it even goes as far as inventing an aristocratic origin, since he will say that he is not his father's son, and that his real father is a certain Rochebrune, who is an aristocrat, who was someone who wrote verses and who would have been his mother's lover. And he says it like that. He completely likes it. There is absolutely no shame in saying that. He prefers to be seen as a prestigious, illegitimate child rather than a legitimate, mediocre one.
It was a fiction that allowed him to distance himself from his own origin, showing how much he is driven by the question of inventing himself, of becoming something other than where the chance of birth placed him. This is what psychoanalysts call self-creation. To depend on no one, not being someone's son, being oneself, and having made oneself.
At 19 years old, the young Arouet frequents the Parisian salons where his wit quickly makes him popular. He becomes a regular at the court held by the Duchess of Maine at the Château de Sceaux.
There are the so-called Nights of Sceaux, which are festive nights, one could say orgies, in which all the guests indulge in all kinds of literary pleasures, especially theatrical and musical.
So the young Arouet is a little joker. He improvises poems saying exactly what these great lords want to hear.
And he is exhilarated by this social success he encounters in Sceaux, and when he was supposed to stop, he crosses the line.
He reveals himself as an extremely biting spirit, extremely facetious, who can become mean.
The arrows of young Arouet hit a target that should not have been aimed at, Philippe of Orleans. Since the death of Louis XIV in 1715, and while waiting for the young Louis XV to be old enough to govern alone, it is he who ensures the regency of the kingdom. An all-powerful man who inspires the future Voltaire with verses heavy with consequences.
This poem is dramatic because it accuses the regent of having the grandsons of Louis XIV killed by poison to get closer to power. And he also accuses Philippe of Orleans of having sexual relations with his daughter, the Duchess of Berry. This poem, Poirot Régnanté, is so frightening that Voltaire would find himself locked up at the Bastille.
Imprisoned on the 16th of May, 1717, at 22 years old, François-Marie Arouet will remain locked up for 11 months. But his detention conditions are far from as terrible as one imagines.
The young Arouet is in a quarter that could be called VIP today at the Bastille, where you dine with the governor, where you are visited, where you receive letters, where you prepare your exit, because if you have been imprisoned, it means you matter. It is a tremendous source of publicity. It puts you in the spotlight.
It is at this moment in his life that the young Arouet decides to find a signature befitting his future glory and to be done with his name, which has become a burden.
If one pronounces it in the manner of the time Arouet, that is to say, the one who is Arouet, meaning the one who is on a scaffold, it is real humiliating.
Obviously, one cannot achieve immortality with such a name. He undoubtedly became aware of this very quickly and thus called himself Voltaire.
This name is particularly effective, bisyllabic, powerful.
Because there is volt in there, and volt, well, that is what dance is. It is volvere in Latin.
It's the invention of a brand, the invention of a name, quite remarkable, a communication effort, we would say today, surprisingly successful.
The young man also takes advantage of his detention to put the finishing touches on what will be his very first work, Oedipus, a play that the illustrious troupe of the Comédie Française has agreed to perform. But upon his release from prison, the rehearsals, and especially the final revisions he makes to his text, cause conflicts with the actors.
The actress named Mademoiselle Demas categorically refused to receive the new verses that Voltaire sent her, but she had a strong sweet tooth. So Voltaire sent her small pastries. She opened the little pies to eat them, and inside were the new verses Voltaire wanted her to learn. Everyone, of course, laughed at this incident. The verses were learned, and the little pies eaten.
The premiere of Oedipe takes place on November 18th, 1718. All of Paris jostles to attend the play by the young author with a scandalous reputation. Even the regent, with whom Voltaire has formed an honorable friendship, is present. The theatre is full, as evidenced by this precious register preserved in the archives of the Comédie Française.
We learn that at this first performance, 17 lower boxes and 7 upper boxes were rented. That means there were really a lot of people in the places where the upscale audience came, particularly the people from the court.
Other seats that are snatched up for this opening night are those placed directly on the stage. An astonishing practice in our eyes, but one that adheres to the conventions of the time.
As there is a social use of the theater, those are the most prestigious seats, since people goes to the theater not only to see a show, but also to be seen. And then especially, what is very important, is the number of tickets at £1, which are the seats in the pit. And there we have 508 tickets, so 508 people who are stand-in. So it's a performance that fills up the theater, and obviously the revenue reflects that. 2,743 livres, that's a very significant revenue. And then above all, what's interesting is to see that this revenue doesn't decrease. But over the course of the performances, we always have very high revenues. So here, for example, 2 days later, we're still at 2,520 livres, which is substantial, right?
Oedipus is performed 45 times in a row at the Comédie Française. Thanks to this triumph, Voltaire, at 24 years old, finally begins to make a living from his writing. His desires for glory are thus simultaneously fulfilled.
The success of Oedipus is essential for Voltaire, because it confirms that he is a great author of classical tragic theatre.
Now a recognized author, Voltaire also enjoys the company of the many friends he has made among the nobility. Among them, Jean-René de Longueuil, whom he frequently visits here at the Château de Maison, located today in the heart of the town of Maison-Lafitte. A house described as a masterpiece by Voltaire himself and attributed to the architect François Mansart. It is here that Voltaire works on writing the Henriade, the epic poem he dedicates to Henry IV. During a reading in the grand hall of the chateau, he does not hesitate to seek the opinions of the guests present.
Some of the participants get into the game and allow themselves a number of criticisms. Clearly, Jean-René de Longueuil is not the last to play this game. Voltaire starts to become angry, and with a sudden gesture, he takes these manuscripts and throws them into the fireplace in a fit of rage. Fortunately, one of the guests quickly retrieves this manuscript to return it to Voltaire.
But one of his visits to the Château de Maison is also the occasion for a dramatic episode. Voltaire contracts a potentially deadly illness, smallpox.
Voltaire is therefore comfortably settled in this room. It is heated. a personal doctor is brought in from the outskirts of Paris specifically to care for Voltaire. He administers all sorts of somewhat curious medicines to him and makes him ingest, I quote Voltaire, 200 pints of lemonade. Voltaire himself is astonished by this treatment. The weeks pass and little by little he regains his health.
Voltaire had barely left the chateau when a fire broke out under the chimney in his room, which had been kept constantly lit during the weeks of his illness. The fire devastates the place, but this twist of fate will not undermine the strong friendship that binds him to Jean-René de Longueuil.
At 30 years old, Voltaire thinks he can finally consider himself equal to the nobles. He, the aristocrat of the spirit. But an altercation with one of them at a social evening will cruelly disabuse him.
The Chevalier de Rohan Chabot makes rather unpleasant jokes about Voltaire's name, saying, "What kind of name is that?" And Voltaire responds with much insolence, "My name begins where yours ends." And that's where it ends. Only a few days later, the night of Rohan Chabot has Voltaire violently beaten at the exit of a house where he had invited him. He is crippled with pain. He receives numerous blows from a stick.
Voltaire asks for reparation and begins to realize that his noble friends pity him, certainly, but do nothing to help him. And as the days go by, Voltaire even notices that he is advised to keep quiet and to overlook this humiliation.
That's something essential because it brings him back to his condition. He may be a star on the literary and social scene. He may be Voltaire, but in fact, he is just a commoner, and therefore can be beaten.
But the humiliation does not stop there, because the young author's desires for vengeance worried the Chevalier's circle enough to send Voltaire to the Bastille once again. He is released after 2 weeks on the condition of leaving Paris. For his exile, Voltaire chose to go to England.
England at that time is the America of the 1950s. That is to say, a much more advanced society, organised quite differently. And it is this curiosity that pushes Voltaire to go there. The timing is right, it allows him to keep a low profile for a few years.
He learns English very quickly through theatre. We are told that he used to go to Drury Lane Theatre and to take the prompter's scripts to learn English through Shakespeare.
His correspondence of the time testifies to his remarkable mastery of the language, but also his great enthusiasm for English customs. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France preserves a collection of some of his letters, including this one written only a few months after his arrival in England.
The fact that he takes pride in writing in English is not insignificant. It's because Voltaire in England feels at home. He very quickly starts to consider himself English. He puts aside his French identity a little. It really seems like he fell in love with this country and its people. He was captivated by the atmosphere of freedom that prevails in England. In England, where, as he said, no way of living seems strange. He writes, "We have men who walk 6 miles a day for their health, feed upon roots, never taste flesh, wear a coat in winter thinner than your ladies do in the hottest days. All that is accounted a particular reason but taxed with folly by nobody. In reality, the French always mock the English for their eccentricity. What Voltaire sees, however, is the freedom to be absolutely what one wants to be.
Voltaire also discovers what the exercise of freedom on a national scale means.
What strikes him a lot about English society is the religious tolerance.
There are Jews, there are Muslims, there are Christians, there are atheists, and all these people live in perfect harmony. It is something that charms and surprises him.
What also fascinates him is the political organisation. The parliamentary system, which is completely unknown on this side of the Channel, appears there in all its strength. The king can only do good. He is prevented as soon as he wants to do harm. A solution that, to him, seems to be politically the best. So, it is another world. It is an advanced world.
During his stay in England, Voltaire keeps a logbook which he completes once back in France. These writings, with their explosive content, would become the letters on the English, or les lettres philosophiques in French.
The letters on the English have two objectives. The first objective is a form of thank you to the society that welcomed him for more than 2 years, the English society, and in a way, England in general. The second objective is obviously to point out what is wrong in France, to see how things are handled in England, and by contrast, the reader understands that what happens in France can be improved.
He criticizes the despotism of the French monarchy and also criticizes the religious intolerance that prevails in France. These are the 2 points that really caused the great scandal.
The seized copies are burned in front of the law court. Because indeed, the power understood well that this text was a bomb.
Barely returned from exile, Voltaire is once again persona non grata in Paris. He will have to keep a low profile and stay away from power for some time.
One cannot say that Voltaire is a ladies' man, but one cannot say either that he was uninterested in women. He had all sorts of conquests during his youth.
He will fall in love with several actresses, but these are fleeting affairs. He apparently loved Adrienne Lecouvreur a lot.
But also, he does not hesitate to shine and to seduce women of the aristocracy.
There is only one woman who really matters, and that is Emily du Châtelet.
Voltaire meets the Marchioness Émilie du Châtelet in 1733 and immediately falls in love. He is 38 years old. She is 26. She has an impressive appearance and a mind that is no less so.
Madame du Châtelet is undoubtedly one of the most brilliant women of the 18th century. She is truly a woman of science.
Very quickly, she shows that she is a little mathematical genius, which does not prevent her from having insights into everything and having an admirable knowledge of literature. And when they meet, it is a mutual love at first sight between 2 geniuses who recognize each other.
When she meets Voltaire, Emily is a woman already married for 8 years to the Marquis du Châtelet, but her marital status is not a hindrance to her rather voluptuous nature.
She is almost volcanic. She has a remarkable inner fire. She is a passionate lover and has quite a few lovers.
We are in this aristocratic milieu, where the freedom of spouses is part of the contract. Emily has rendered the services that were asked of her. She lived with du Châtelet, she gave him children, and she believes she has done her duty and that from now on she is free.
The love story between Émilie and Voltaire will fully blossom here at the Château de Cirey, property of the Marquis du Châtelet in Haute-Marne. Voltaire came to seek refuge there in 1734, after the scandal caused by the letters on the English.
Voltaire only plans to stay in Cirey for a few months, just long enough to be forgotten in Paris. But when he arrives in Cirey, against all odds, he falls in love with the place and decides to settle there. So, initially, he will undertake to restore the existing part, with the agreement, of course, of the Marquis de Châtelet. And then he will continue. Finding the castle too small, he decides to expand it to install a wing where he will set up his own apartments. And what's amusing is that not only does he have part of the chateau built at his own expense, but he also leaves his mark, his identity, by having this beautiful carved door dedicated to the arts and sciences constructed. We can find references to astronomy, painting, sculpture, writing.
At the Château de Cirey, Voltaire and Émilie live a life full of pleasures and inspiration, punctuated by the sound of bells.
Voltaire is someone who hates wasting time. He is always doing something, and to try to waste as little time as possible. He imposes a very particular pace on the house's inhabitants. The first bell rings at 10 in the morning. So then, everyone is allowed to leave their room to go have coffee in the gallery where we are now.
The days at Cirey are divided between very important philosophical discussions, pleasures of love, of course, and various experiments.
They are two, I would say, relentless workers. Each works in their office, in their room, and they meet at meals.
There is a true source of happiness, both physical, the joy of being together, not being bothered by the surrounding society, and intellectual.
Voltaire writes in a letter to a friend, "We are very voluptuous philosophers."
This total communion does not prevent intellectual competition between the two lovers. Notably, when Voltaire participates in an essay competition on the propagation of fire, organized by the prestigious Academy of Sciences.
And she, who did not agree at all with Voltaire's theses on this subject. She secretly sent her own essay on the same subject. They did not win the contest, neither of them. But Voltaire insisted a lot that Madame du Châtelet's paper be published by the Academy of Sciences, which was a great honor, and he did not ask the same for himself at all. That is a beautiful proof of love.
At Cirey, the couple also engages in scientific experimentation. Voltaire does not hesitate to pay the substantial sum of 10,000 livres to Abbé Nollet, the most famous manufacturer in the kingdom, to create his physics cabinet, the first in Europe owned by a private individual. The Musée des Arts et Métiers in Paris preserves in its collection some of the devices designed by this genius of scientific popularization.
In the 18th century, people started setting up physics cabinets, which became actual places of science. These were locations where they tried to replicate natural phenomena in order to observe and explain them better. So Nollet is a key figure in this story. He is one of the pioneers in terms of popularization, and especially one of the first Frenchmen to build scientific instruments. This instrument we see here is a pneumatic machine. It's quite typical of the instruments that Nollet might have supplied in the physics cabinets. Beyond the rather sumptuous craftsmanship of the object, it's an instrument that allows the study of the pneumatic. And this object works by depriving the space under the bell of air. So we put a small lit candle or a small animal under the bell, activate the pump, which draws the air, and we observe that the candle flame goes out or that the animal is suffocating. And we are therefore identifying the difference between air and the vacuum.
If the two lovers experiment together, the true scholar of the two is indeed Émilie du Châtelet. She signs the first translation of Newton's Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, one of the major works in scientific history.
One cannot say that Voltaire became a man of science. Nevertheless, he was interested in scientific phenomena, notably that of universal gravitation, to draw philosophical conclusions. Everything that is irrational, everything that cannot be explained does not exist. That's what interests him.
Voltaire and Émilie du Châtelet are undoubtedly the key couple of this particular century, the 18th, which sees the emergence of a new ambition among many intellectuals to bring the world out of darkness into light, or rather, the Enlightenment.
In the age of enlightenment, it is the century illuminated by the lights of reason, and men and women must rely on their experience and knowledge to understand the world they live in.
So the 18th century is the period when the entire world is mapped. We begin to understand all the mechanisms of the human body. And knowledge enables emancipation. We are no longer subjected to the traditional obligation to hold our role and place in a society that is both religious and patriarchal. Precisely because we have knowledge, because we have thought about it, we can break free from it.
And there is no need to respect any hierarchy whatsoever, even if it is religious. It's about learning to reason rather than to believe.
Brilliant minds of their century, Voltaire and Émilie du Châtelet, do not forget to indulge in the varied pastimes possible at the Château de Cirey.
There are many moments of entertainment, always at the sound of the bell. They go for a carriage ride along the river, the Blaise, flowing at the foot of the castle. Voltaire goes hunting. He is a very bad shot. But the main entertainment at Cirey is the theatre.
During his years at Cirey, Voltaire continues his theatrical work, plays that the couple performs with their friends in a genuine little theatre set up in the attic.
This theatre has all the ingredients, although very small, of a grand theatre. So a stage curtain, scenery, a dressing room, benches to sit on, everything needed to have fun. It is a very important place because they spend many afternoons and evenings there. There are several rehearsals per week, but also several performances. And sometimes, the only spectator we have is the Marchioness du Châtelet's dog. So to make up for this lack of spectators, Voltaire sometimes calls on the residents of Cirey. On the occasion of L'Enfant Prodigue, a play he wrote specifically for the Cirey theatre, the villagers present boo. Voltaire is furious and then chases them away with a stick.
But daily life at Cirey is also marked by disputes between these two strong personalities. Émilie can be extremely authoritarian by nature.
She chooses how he must dress. She chooses the wine he must drink. She forbids him from showing certain texts that she locks up with a double key at her place.
She knows that Voltaire writes subversive texts, and if the nature of these texts were known, well, the consequences could be even more severe. So Madame du Châtelet monitors everything. She keeps an eye on his correspondence.
There are many moments of tension. So when they argue, they speak in English to avoid being understood. It is not uncommon for Voltaire to leave the table in anger, to get upset, to sulk. And then to reconcile, They resume dialogue through small notes that they send via the servants present.
Voltaire and Émilie will remain together for many more years, sharing an intellectual bond, but each living romantic adventures on their own.
Voltaire built his fortune first through a lottery. He partners with several of his friends, especially the mathematician La Condamine, to take advantage of a very poorly organised lottery in such a way that the partners realise that by buying all the tickets they can win the jackpot being significantly higher than the total of all the tickets purchased. And since this lottery is monthly, one can collect 1 million per month. Can you imagine, even if it has to be shared, the profit that was made by Voltaire?
Then, Voltaire made financial investments, real estate investments. He has a sense of business and also knows how to lend money to affluent but spendthrift people. Over time, he built up a real fortune.
Thanks to this wealth, Voltaire and the Marchioness du Châtelet lead a very comfortable lifestyle. It's Émilie who, with Voltaire's money, takes care of decorating their various residences. The Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris houses objects in the style that the Marchioness was fond of, especially chinoiseries, very fashionable at that time. Pieces made in Europe and inspired by the Orient.
Émilie du Châtelet was passionate about pagodas and figurines. This is exactly what you have here. Small statuettes that represent Asian deities seen through a Western lens. So, with a lot of imagination, of course. And among these figurines and pagodas, some particularly curious because their heads can be moved back and forth, or to the side, oscillate at the slightest draft. So it also contributed to the collectors' amusement and their pride. Their pride in having such objects within their collections that adorned mantles, dressers. They were absolutely everywhere. European manufacturers incorporated elements of China into their entire production of tableware as well. One can quite imagine Voltaire and Émilie du Châtelet's table with pieces decorated in kakiemon, which were the most appreciated type of decor in the 1740s.
Having become a rich and famous man, Voltaire has everything to be happy. Yet he lacks one essential thing in his eyes, the recognition of the powerful.
He wants to be at the court because it gives him power. He wishes to hold missions that can ensure his prestige and make his ideas prevail. So compromises with the highest authority are necessary.
Thanks to his well-placed friends, Voltaire was commissioned to create a comédie ballet, performed on the occasion of the marriage of Louis, the Dauphin of France, eldest son of Louis XV. On February 23, 1745, in Versailles, La Princesse de Navarre, the show imagined by Voltaire, is performed before the entire court. For practical reasons, the performance takes place in the grand stable of the chateau.
There was no theatre in Versailles at that time, so a wooden structure is built, which looked like the kind of structure we have here. So it was very large in order to allow for a performance with music, ballet, dance, and a ball at the end of the performance. There are boxes on the sides, there are bleachers in the back, there is a very large stage because there are machines and many, many characters, and there is a vast floor area where most of the spectators are.
This play, Voltaire struggled to complete, yet he knows he can derive great privileges from it.
He complains several times about being forced to do this work, and notably, he writes, "I am a little ashamed to abandon my solitude and my philosophy to become the king's entertainer at 50 years. But at the same time, the success of the play is going to be decisive for the future, since it will ensure him what he expects, a position as a gentleman in ordinary service to the king. And so, he will write very quickly to request this position."
Voltaire also attains the prestigious position of historiographer of the king, tasked by Louis XV with writing the history of the monarchy and the Kingdom of France. Then he obtains what he had long coveted, a seat at the French Academy. But the state of grace that Voltaire enjoys at Versailles does not last. In this hall of mirrors, where those seeking the king's attention crowd, he quickly feels confined in his courtier's attire.
He does not see the king as God's representative on earth. Therefore, it becomes difficult to perform these signs of adoration that are expected of courtiers. He is very insolent, very impertinent, we might say, and on the other hand, he wields the pen extremely effectively. So he is a somewhat unsettling half-courtier, and moreover, the royal power will constantly be wearing.
Louis XV never really accepted Voltaire. Voltaire is profoundly antipathetic to him. He thinks that he is a man with subversive ideas, and he does not want to hear about him.
The future Frederick II writes to Voltaire asking him to correct his verses, since Frederick II is obsessed with the French language and speaks German only with the horses. And he puts above all the French language and mastery of the French language.
He writes a letter to Voltaire, so toadying, saying he's the greatest writer of all time, the man he admires the most in Europe, etc. And Voltaire is so flattered to find himself celebrated that much by the future king of Prussia, it made him dizzy.
A kind of complicity will develop between the two, for the freedom of spirit and ideas. And Voltaire sees, in the future king of Prussia, the possibility of having a particular role, the role of the one who thinks for the prince or takes part in developing a political reflection. He envisions this kind of philosopher-king duo.
Having become king, Frederick II continually invites Voltaire to join him in Prussia, a pressing epistolary courtship of which his companion Emilie quickly takes umbrage.
There is a very ambiguous relationship between Voltaire and Frederick. Madame du Châtelet understands that Frederick is a rival, and a rival, one could almost say, in romantic terms.
It is truly a competition between the two, a competition of seduction. Voltaire would really like to go to the court, but as long as Madame du Châtelet is there, he will never go.
Fate, terrible, will decide for Voltaire. Emilie, pregnant by her lover at the time, dies following childbirth on September 10th, 1749.
Voltaire was truly mad with grief.
Even though passionate love had turned into affectionate friendship, Madame du Châtelet was the woman he loved the most in his life.
It was after this irreparable loss for him that he decided to leave for Prussia.
In July 1750, Voltaire arrives in Potsdam near Berlin, where Frederick II's court is located. This is at the beautiful Sanssouci Palace, the king's summer residence, that he stays upon his arrival. His room, in pure Rococo style, is adorned with garlands of flowers and fruits and decorated with exotic animals. At the court, Voltaire is granted the honorary title of Chamberlain. In his daily routine, his main task is to correct and embellish Frederick II's verses. But the highlights of his life in Prussia are actually his meals at the king's table.
Here we enter the audience hall of the Sanssouci Palace, which is also the dining room. And here, in the center of the room where I stand, you have to imagine the table set up for Frederick's guests. It's not an immense table like those usually seen in other palaces, such as the Palace of Versailles under Louis XIV. It's a smaller oval table surrounded by carefully chosen friends allowed to come here to this palace to dine with the king. When Voltaire was in Potsdam, this is where he dined with Frederick II.
He is there, if you will, to entertain, to set the mood.
But he is not the only one. There are several scholars, several philosophers around Frederick, and Voltaire will become one of them. And he is no longer the great, the most important, as he was at the beginning.
Voltaire finds himself merely a foil for a king whose verses, in his opinion, are of great mediocrity. But these quips, however, can be biting, as the philosopher learns to his cost.
Voltaire hears a conversation from the monarch, or it is reported to him, and the king would have said, "You squeeze the orange and throw away the peel." So, Voltaire is somewhat considered a jester who can be discarded when his services are no longer needed.
It is at that moment when Voltaire feels that the tide has truly turned for him, that he is no longer respected by the king, and that it is time to flee.
After a 3-year stay, Voltaire leaves the court of Prussia in March 1753. He thinks he is done with the king, but an extraordinary event will delay his return to France.
Arriving in Frankfurt, he is arrested by the henchmen of Frederick II, who place him under house arrest until he has returned a certain number of documents.
He had kept the drafts of Frederick's poems and the corrections he had made. And when the king learned this, he thought, "This is a disaster for me." It shows how much Voltaire was a co-author of my writings.
Voltaire is going to be stuck for several weeks.
He saw it as a kind of humiliation inflicted on him by someone he had previously praised.
It is almost a farce being played in Frankfurt, a rather sinister farce from which Voltaire eventually manages to emerge.
After returning the documents, Voltaire can finally leave. The king and the philosopher will not see each other again, but their letter friendship will resume nonetheless. At 60 years old, Voltaire falls under the charm of a quiet and bucolic place near Lake Geneva, a small peaceful property in Geneva, from where he can see Mont Blanc.
We are in the large living room of Les Délices, the property Voltaire bought in Geneva, which at the time was called the Saint-Jean property. And Voltaire feels so good there that he settles into his délices, or delights, as he calls it in his correspondence. This is a Voltaire who becomes a property owner after having been very itinerant throughout his life, since he left the court in Paris. And Voltaire is going to do a great deal of work, notably expanding the house to settle in a bit more comfortably, but also on the exteriors. With Voltaire, new trees are planted and vines grow in the Park of Les Délices. At the time, the Republic of Geneva is independent. It is not part of any kingdom, so it is outside French borders, outside Prussian borders as well. So he settles in a completely neutral territory.
What is very important in Geneva for Voltaire is, on one hand, being next to France but just on the other side of the border, thus avoiding potential attacks from the French authorities because he has become very wary. And then, there is also the fact that there is a whole network of French-speaking publishing in Geneva and Switzerland, which for him will be very helpful to diffuse his work.
At Les Délices, Voltaire settles with Madame Denis, his niece and mistress. She manages the household affairs. Voltaire spends a lot of time in his garden, entertains guests, but his main activity remains writing.
Les Délices retain a large number of Voltaire's furniture, notably this Louis XV style desk, which has very beautiful marquetry. One can see floral motifs and also musical motifs. It is on this desk that Voltaire wrote a large number of his works. And Voltaire also had a small writing desk. As you can see, it's also marquetry, which allowed him to write even during his travels. Everything fit together. There is a pen holder. And inside, there are also two small silver objects with Voltaire's coat of arms, featuring 3 flames and 2 greyhounds. These silver objects are a travel inkwell containing the ink Voltaire used to draft his letters. And on the other side, a powder box. And once a page was written, Voltaire sprinkled sand from inside. It acted as a blotting paper and absorbed the excess ink from the document.
Voltaire notably writes his poem on the disaster of Lisbon after the earthquake of 1755. But above all, he writes his most well-known work, still widely read today, his philosophical fiction, Candide, in which he broaches all the major themes of the Enlightenment.
The work here is the original edition of this text translated from the German by Dr. Ralph in 1759. Now today, we know this text is by Voltaire, but initially, Voltaire once again used a pseudonym to publish his writings. The use of the pseudonym will allow Voltaire to disseminate some passages of Candide already in his correspondence, and eventually to promote Dr. Ralph by indicating that it's a book essential, and he even quotes passages from it. It's a true advertising campaign, a sort of early teasing that will make Candide the bestseller of the second half of the 18th century.
Voltaire himself is surprised by the success of this tale. Very quickly, nearly 20,000 copies are sold. For the time, this is quite a considerable number. The tale is published in various formats, in quarto format and in octavo format, meaning pocket formats or more luxurious formats. In short, Candide is almost a global success.
Quickly, the property of Les Délices becomes too small to accommodate all the guests who want to meet the philosopher. Moreover, Voltaire does not find the full freedom he hoped for in Geneva.
In Geneva, there is something that Voltaire has difficulty accepting, which is that theater is prohibited. So he makes arrangements and gives small theatrical performances at Les Délices.
He has troubles with the Geneva pastors who view very unfavorably that he organizes theatre sessions at Les Délices and that he trains the daughters of the Calvinist pastors to act, which is entirely unacceptable, of course. In short, he decides to move to the Château de Ferney.
Ferney is an extraordinary place since it's in France, but it's on the Swiss border, so a strategic location.
He will turn Ferney into a realized utopia. That is to say, a world where the land is enhanced, where people live comfortably and where they are safe.
He is going to take the opportunity to try to arrange the village of Ferney to his liking, which was in quite a miserable state, and embark on multiple ventures that show he is not just a pure mind, but that he is capable of taking action and doing good around him. And this will have an immense impact.
Under Voltaire's reign, Ferney experiences spectacular development. This growth is mainly due to the massive arrival of watchmakers. Voltaire takes advantage of a social crisis in Geneva to bring these craftsmen. We can still see few examples of watches made during that time today. One of them is preserved in the Louvre Museum.
This watch comes from the workshops of the Royal Manufactory of Ferney, which was established in 1770. It is a small, round gold watch with an enameled back, depicting a scene from Ovid's Metamorphoses showing Vertumnus and Pomona. The whole scene is framed with small brackets, chiseled Rococo elements, scattered with little enameled blue flowers. The dial is enameled in white. You can clearly see the signature of the two watchmakers who created this watch, Dufour and Serret in Ferney, so truly a complete signature. And on the movement of the watch, you can also see engraved Royal Manufacture of Ferney. Voltaire sets up a number of workshops in Ferney. He has houses built. He welcomes them with open arms, of course. It is even said that he accommodated some workers in his own castle in Ferney. He provides them with gold and really tries to support them to make their work easier. In this regard, he is completely opposed to the leaders of the Republic of Geneva.
In a few years, the small town becomes a major production center. In 1773, it has 600 workers, and the number of watches made that year is estimated at 4,000. It should be said that Voltaire does everything possible to make his operation work.
He will solicit all the courtiers, the aristocrats, by praising the merits of his watches. He says they are the prettiest, as beautiful as those made in Paris, London, and Geneva, and they are cheaper. And that is a very important selling point for Voltaire, who ultimately becomes a kind of sales representative for the watchmaking of Ferney. These watches are sold in certain European countries like Spain, the Netherlands, and Italy. They are also sold in Turkey.
He sells them even to the Empress of Russia, Catherine II, to whom he says, "Oh, but surely you have made a mistake. I don't know what happened. You ordered 10 watches and I don't know how it happened, but I mistakenly sent you 100. Knowing, of course, that Catherine II was going to pay for the 100 watches, we thus have a whole collection of anecdotes, each more delightful than the last, showing that Voltaire was the economic heart and soul of the entire region of Gex during the 18 years of his stay.
Voltaire was never an atheist. He is a deist. He believes that in the complexity of nature, there must be a power that governs all this. What shocks him is the institution. The weight of the institution that tells you what you are allowed to believe or not believe, classifies you among the heretics, sends you to the stake, etc.
It is not only Christianity, Catholicism, or Protestantism that Voltaire combats, but any form of religion claiming to be revealed. Naturally, he accuses the three major monotheistic religions. Christianity, of course, but also Judaism and then Islam.
In the France of Louis XV, tensions persist between Catholics and Protestants. Protestantism is not a recognized religion, and its followers are still sometimes subject to repression and even persecution.
What he observes in the 1750s and 60s is a resurgence of tensions between religions. And indeed, it seems to him that this religious fanaticism is the scourge of the contemporary world.
He cannot accept that in the name of religion, in the name of a supposedly good God, men have such atrocious practices. Always in the name of God.
There is, and this is also part of his legend, the idea that at each St. Bartholomew's Day, he is seized by spasms, he feels ill, he feels weak, and he is confined to bed. It shows, in any case, that religious fanaticism associated with the abuse of power is always present and always a threat.
Starting from 1760, Voltaire intensifies his fight with this powerful phrase, "Crush the infamous." This expression notably appears in the correspondence he exchanges with the philosopher d'Alembert.
For example, here we see that he is talking about his readings. Naturally, he talks about philosophy, but also about life in Paris, which he hears about in the newspapers. And he concluded his letter to d'Alembert by saying, "Farewell, my great philosopher, crush the infamous." What is this infamous thing he wants to crush? It is superstition. It is the power of religion over justice or politics. It is the influence. The influence of the Jesuits, the influence of the Calvinists, the influence of the Jansenists on power. And it is against this that he will wage his greatest battles in the 1760s. And at the bottom of his correspondence we will find this expression that will eventually shorten to écrit l'inf, or crush infam in English, then simply to EL, or CI in English. And for him, it will really be a kind of very strong slogan that will recur over the years. One must know that this phrase, crush the infamous, is quite subversive. So Voltaire will use it with philosophers like d'Alembert. But in the end it's a slogan he will not spread widely, because when he writes as he still does to princes, to monarchs who hold their power from God, it obviously goes over very poorly. So, it says crush the infamous correspondences are more discreet.
But it is an incident that pushes Voltaire to engage even further in this fight. On March 10, 1762, Jean Calas, a merchant from Toulouse, was condemned to the punishment of the wheel and strangled in the public place.
Jean Calas is an old Protestant accused in Toulouse of having murdered his son because the son supposedly wished to convert to the Catholic religion. In fact, the son might have wanted to convert to Catholicism, but he committed suicide and hanged himself.
Voltaire at first is not interested in this case. When he hears about it, he even wonders if Calas is guilty.
He only truly becomes aware of what it's about through the visit of a Protestant who goes to him and tells him the story and explains that it is a blatant injustice.
Voltaire studies the case file extensively and denounces a quick and biased investigation. For him, there is no doubt that Jean Calas was executed because he was Protestant. For 3 years, Voltaire tries to redeem Calas's memory by relying on his network.
He writes to the most influential people. He tries to show them that there is a terrible misunderstanding.
When we look at Voltaire's correspondence, the number of letters to convince each person by name to join the fight for Calas, we can think, but he dedicated hours and hours of his life to the memory of Calas.
He will win the case. It will take several years for the judgment of Toulouse to first be annulled and for Jean Calas to then be redeemed, but he will succeed. The King's Council will carry out this reversal, which is quite exceptional.
Voltaire would then engage in other matters, but the story of Jean Calas remains the fight of his life. It is on this occasion that he writes the Treatise on Tolerance, a work that remains a reference even today.
When the Parisians demonstrated in the streets, the day after the Charlie Hebdo shooting and the Hyperkasher kosher supermarket siege, what did they have in their hands? The Treatise on Tolerance. Spontaneously, people, even the youngest, went to find this man who lived 250 years ago as the one who best embodies French liberties, meaning freedom for all, that is superior to any belief, whatever it may be.
Voltaire calls himself the innkeeper of Europe simply because the castle of Ferney is going to host a very, very large number of people from all over Europe.
Every day, visitors arrive at Ferney, and everyone is received by Voltaire. Sometimes he gives kind words. Sometimes he just settles for a few nods.
It could be writers, it could be aristocrats, it could be scholars who will work in Italy on the excavations of Herculaneum and Pompeii.
Let's not forget, although we tend to do so, that all over Europe, the aristocracy and the enlightened bourgeoisie, I would say, speaks French. Yet, at that time, in Europe, no one equals Voltaire. Because he makes people laugh, because he makes people cry, because he has an extraordinarily agile mind. Everyone reads Voltaire.
Some women even come and kiss Voltaire's hands. Coming to such a place to meet a man of letters and bow before him as if he were a religious figure is a truly remarkable phenomenon.
He's a star, like the 18th century has not known another.
It's also one of the most fruitful periods in Voltaire's correspondence. In Ferney, he writes nearly a quarter of his 25,000 known letters. This correspondence is an integral part of his work.
He was a very, very skilled communicator at that time when people wrote letters, unofficial letters, official letters, clandestine letters. You can see how he deals with the powerful, with authorities. He divides to conquer. That's why there are very few correspondences to be read as masterpieces.
He talks about everything in this correspondence. He talks as much about his life, the lives of others, and then a certain number of extraordinary thoughts that spring forth and somehow complete his work.
I must confess that if I were to go to a deserted island, I would take Voltaire's correspondence. I consider the 28 or 30 volumes of Voltaire's correspondence to be the most exciting reading of all. You can reread this correspondence without ever getting bored. I wouldn't say the same for all the others.
In a completely exceptional manner, Voltaire also had the privilege of a marble statue during his lifetime, whereas this privilege was generally reserved for the king. This work, created by Jean-Baptiste Pigalle, is exhibited in the Louvre Museum.
It's a work that is very important and depicts Voltaire nude with just a small drapery sitting on a tree trunk, and here you see two accessories, a mask which represents comedy and a dagger which represents tragedy. But it is also important to notice this phylactery, this piece of paper, which is the attribute of prophets. And Voltaire is depicted with this phylactery and barefoot like a prophet because he is the prophet of the Republic of Letters who announces the time of the liberation of the individual. The statue was funded by a subscription launched among literary people. That's what you see on the base of the statue. Among the subscribers were King Frederick II of Prussia, the King of Denmark, and also Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was Voltaire's great enemy and subscribed for the statue. In fact, Voltaire was outraged that Rousseau could put a louis in his statue.
Pigalle was inspired by representations of the great philosophers of antiquity. He creates a nude Voltaire, but without idealizing him, which causes a scandal.
He wanted to show Voltaire in his true human form, meaning he is an old man, but he is a beautiful old man. There is going to be a lot of irony. King Gustav III of Sweden, who is passing through Paris, says he is willing to subscribe, but for an outfit. So he did not understand Pigalle's message at all, and there is a lot of sarcasm, little sonnets that ridicule Voltaire and the statue. Voltaire then understands that it's necessary to stop this controversy a little, and he writes saying, "It's a work of art. I myself suffered too much from censorship. If he sees it that way, he's a great artist, so he must be left free."
If Voltaire enjoys tremendous recognition in his ferny domain, he dreams of one last stay in Paris. At 83 years old, an exceptional age for the time, he no longer has much to fear from the power held by the young Louis XVI. In February 1778, he therefore undertakes his grand return to the capital, which he left 30 years earlier.
It's thousands of Parisians who cheer him. He can't leave his house without Parisians gathering around his car.
One would like to touch him as one touches relics.
Some suggest unhitching the horses to take their place in order to have the honor of transporting this modern-day Apollo to his home.
A crowd is packed onto the balconies and on the rooftops. So, yes, it's something quite surprising for the time.
Voltaire settles at his friend the Marquis de Villette's on Quai de Théatin, which is now called Quai Voltaire. It is there that he completes the writing of his last play, Irène, whose performance at the Comédie Française is the highlight of this visit.
We are performing Irène, but actually one could say that the spectators have little interest in the play, listening to it with a distracted ear, and are only interested in Voltaire.
But it doesn't matter at all. It's a phenomenal success, and at the end of the performance, they bring the bust of Voltaire. He is crowned, and the French actors sing verses in honor of this great man. Then Voltaire stands up, himself crowned with laurels, and he says, "You will make me die of pleasure." And that is the apotheosis of Voltaire.
After 3 months of a hectic Parisian life, Voltaire's health deteriorates. Before it is too late, they try to extract a confession from him.
Voltaire was dying for several days. Everyone knew that he could not be saved. And at that moment, the issue of Voltaire's burial arises.
What might happen is that his body could be thrown into the street with all the garbage, quite simply, and not be buried in consecrated ground. For that, he would need to confess to being a good Christian to a sworn priest who could give him the last rites.
His religious enemies absolutely wanted him to renounce his anti-Christian ideas at the last moment and convert to Catholicism. He did not convert. He never denied his works.
Voltaire dies on May 30th, 1778. He is 83 years old. To spare him a pauper's grave, hurried preparations are made to transfer his body out of Paris to the Abbey of Célière.
The body is opened and embalmed by candlelight on the kitchen table of the Marquis de Villette. The heart and brain removed for preservation, and the entrails are thrown into the latrine.
And there, an absolutely incredible staging is used. The body is dressed in civilian clothes.
They put a cap on his head because they opened his skull to remove his brain. They apply makeup, color his lips and cheeks to give the illusion of life, and they strap him in so he can remain upright in the carriage, and all these people leave in secret.
Ferney is too far to transport Voltaire's remains there. They choose to take him to the Abbey of Célière in Champagne, where Voltaire's nephew, Abbot Mignot, is in charge. Now a private property, the abbey has preserved a remnant of the burial site.
Here is Voltaire's tombstone with the anagram AV, meaning Arouet of Voltaire, and the year of his death, 1778. And this is the exact place where Voltaire was buried. That is to say, there was a church here that belonged to the abbey, and in the middle of this church, a hole was made, and Voltaire was buried there. During the wake around Voltaire, the weather was threatening. And in the night, when everyone is in the church, the storm begins with such intensity that the doors suddenly open, the candles go out, and the body tips over on its trestles. The monks start to pray, rather panicked and in the dark. Some even say that there were balls of fire rolling on the grass, and that it was certainly the work of a devil. When calm returned, they held their private mass, and also the requiem, the next day, and buried him.
Voltaire's body rested at Célière until 1791, the year his ashes were moved to the Pantheon. His heart, removed during the embalming, is first placed in Voltaire's room at Ferney. A mausoleum was specially arranged there. It is then entrusted to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France and placed in the base of the statue by Houdon, representing Voltaire. In 2010, under unexpected circumstances, the laboratory of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France was able to analyze the precious organ, or at least what was left of it.
During renovation work of these spaces, the statue of Voltaire had to be temporarily moved And during this relocation, there was a very strong, very unusual smell emanating from the base of the statue. So, a locksmith was called to open the hatch. And there, we found a wooden box, which we opened in our laboratory. And there, it was a bit of a surprise. We found this gilded metal box, heart-shaped, bearing the following inscription: Heart of Voltaire, deceased in Paris, the 30th of May, 1778. Taking advantage of the small opening, we performed a fibroscopy, and then the doctors noticed the presence of an organ, but it was really deformed. It did not look like a heart. It looked more like a potato. It was all deformed, all shriveled. Its consistency was a bit like a candied cherry. And despite the dilapidated state of the tissue, they still managed to demonstrate that it was striated muscle tissue. And the heart is a muscle. So, we presume that it is Voltaire's heart.
To respect his burial site, Voltaire's heart has since been placed back into the base of the statue, like one would have done with the relic of a saint. Ultimate irony of history that would undoubtedly have amused Voltaire, who, all his life, fought the church.